Elizabeth Shaffer, University of British Columbia, Submission 101. The title of the presentation is Social Media Adoption in Government, a Provocation on Disrupting Practices and Policy Alternatives. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So I'm going to speak about a research project, my dissertation research, the research context, the research data and the objectives, some of the findings, particularly those that relate to policy, implications for policy, and some suggested future research. This paper discusses qualitative research that focused on the early adoption and practices of social media by public servants and government agencies in the Government of Canada at a critical time in its early adoption, specifically 2013 and 2014, when agencies and public servants were in the nascent stages of adoption. It examined the challenges and issues of emergent technology adoption and related policy development practices. The study drew upon practice theory as a generative lens for understanding the processes of collecting and maintaining a record of government communications produced through for-profit, privately owned social media platforms. Records, a particular form of data, held in national and institutional archives, can serve as instruments of accountability and transparency for government actions or inactions, and can aid in facilitating long-term social remembering. As digital technologies advance, data and records that were traditionally analog are increasingly generated within network digital platforms. Frequently, these platforms are proprietary, for-profit, and lack algorithmic transparency. The records of Western government institutions are often the responsibility of archival institutions. Such a responsibility carries an implicit obligation to protect the integrity of the relationships between citizens and governments to which records can bear witness. What happens when these records are generated through, owned, and controlled by social media platforms? How do emerging practices, technologies, and policy frameworks affect the generation, management, and preservation of government records that must remain discoverable and accessible within existing government structures, for example, in service to enacting individual and collective rights? Increased use of social media by governments takes place within the broader information policy environment, often without proper consideration given to this larger policy context. Three primary issues arise at the intersection of social media use in government and information policy. Firstly, many of the policy instruments that address identified issues of privacy, security, access, and preservation predate the existence of platform technologies. Secondly, emerging social media policy instruments are often predicated on anticipated or perceived hurdles, for example, liability or unauthorized use, and seek to circumvent and or ameliorate them with little empirical evidence of how these technologies are actually being used. And thirdly, platform technologies, such as social media, are in constant state of development and change, with platform creators having full control over their features, making the government's capacity to adapt, and keep pace to ever-changing platforms challenging or impossible. The study gathered empirical data, including 28 interview participants, 34 legislative and policy instruments, online and offline observations, and 35 documentary sources, which were analyzed using a practice lens. The main objectives of the study were to gain an understanding of the relationship between social media practices, policy, and information management and record-keeping practices in the Government of Canada during an early phase of social media adoption, and to contribute to the discourse surrounding shifting social media practices and the implications for policy and records as instruments of accountability. This paper focuses on the aspects relating to those questions it raises around policy, practices, and formulation in relation to rapidly emerging practices and developing technologies. So I'll be discussing, as I mentioned, some of the findings around the policy issues in particular, beginning with information culture, policy, and practices. The research findings suggest that Canadian public servants enthusiastically engaged with social media platforms, often unofficially and outside of the formal structures of government, in their professional roles, seeking to practice what they perceived as the spirit of social media platforms in efforts to better engage and network both within and outside of government agencies. They saw these technologies as better enabling them to enact their roles as public servants, often conveying a robust commitment to these roles and public service in Canada generally. The shared collaborative social and work practices developing amongst public servants engaging social media technologies operated within and sometimes replaced the more hierarchical information practices of traditional government workflows. As practices depend on the activities that make them up, as well as the conditions in which they unfold, these assemblages of interconnected actions were situated in an evolving information environment, with many participants enlisting social media in support of both collective and individual agency, in navigating the tensions and affordances they perceive between platforms and the Government of Canada information and policy environment. While the government rhetoric driving agency adoption of social media platforms was that of greater openness and access, the influence of the government hierarchy, top-down decision-making, and entrenched bureaucracy influenced the pace of adoption and challenged existing information frameworks and practices. The Westminster model of governance in the Canadian system, which Canadian public administration scholar Jeffrey Roy describes as, quote, inward and control-oriented, unquote, fostered a view towards information and communication that supported a culture of containment, arguably antithetical to the purported ethos of social media platforms. Findings point to an information culture in the Government of Canada at the time of data collection that was linked to power dynamics and that was politically influenced. Klang and Nolan, researchers who studied Swedish government social media policies, argue that there is an impulse to view new social media technologies in relation to earlier technologies, which they argue fails to fully comprehend the social media infrastructure in that it is not just an improvement upon existing technologies, but a break from these communication technologies and, quote, a medium that changes the ways in which communication occurs, unquote. So the role of policy. In the Canadian federal government system, the Treasury Board Secretariat, or TBS, is the owner of all government-wide policy instruments, and beginning in 2008, began to issue instruments guiding the use of social media in government. The study's findings demonstrate that the Treasury Board recognized the increased use of social media in the Government of Canada by departments and individuals, the issues it surfaced, and the necessity for government-wide policy instruments to help drive balance between productivity, innovation, and risk, as well as provide guidance on the appropriate use of these platforms. The Treasury Board acknowledged that social media use by the Government of Canada agencies and individual public servants brought with it significant benefits as well as questions. It viewed social media as key to advancing priorities such as effective communications and quality service delivery to Canadians. As increasing numbers of Canadians take to social media, the Government of Canada foresaw increased use in and interactions between the Government of Canada and Canadian citizens, and recognized policy instruments needed to address key challenges, including access, what was then a siloed approach to use, and the lack of clear standards. In discussing the Government of Canada policy instruments, some participants viewed the web, and by extension social media, as a channel that carries government information. Thus, they were keen to explain the ways in which a complex variety of overlapping and layered policy instruments applied. While the Treasury Board is the official Government of Canada policy issuing and monitoring authority, it is cognizant of the variety of obligations and restrictions government agencies may fall under depending on their remit and scope. So this necessitates a broad policy approach that allows agencies to enact Treasury Board policy instruments within their context and develop rules that are relevant to their environment. Across government, the Privacy Act, the Access to Information Act, and the Official Languages Act were all cited as applicable in addition to each agency's own regulatory frameworks. Policy instruments were viewed by participants as what shapes and governs the roles and responsibilities of public servants. The interviews suggest recognition on the part of public servants that policy instruments are binding and hold a great amount of authority in their enacted work environments. However, according to some participants, the majority of public servants are tasked with implementing policy rather than contributing to its development. So I'm going to speak now about policy development. So how are government policies and their development frameworks informed or informed by social media during this time? Findings demonstrate that the policy development structures in the Government of Canada were still shaped by a command and control information framework, despite a rhetoric of opening up the policy process to more collaborative practices. Policy development around social media platforms was slow to make its way through the bureaucratic channels of the Canadian federal government, and findings indicate that efforts towards collaborative policy making within these platforms were bogged down in bureaucracy once it reached a certain level within the system. The centralized mechanism of the Treasury Board in the policy process contribute to this bureaucracy. Participants noted that once the process and product moved from internal collaborative platform-based tools into the more formalized policy mechanisms, the content, pace, and product changed. This is in line with Rory's observations that social media and related technologies expose the limitations of the Government of Canada's mindset of information containment and control, as well as supporting Klang and Nolan's policy research, which finds an underlying strategy of command and control amongst the majority of government social media policies they examined. This highlights both the disruptive impact of practices that social media may have, as well as the requirements for existing practices and systems to adopt more agile and responsive processes in light of rapidly evolving digital platforms. Challenges to the policy development process were surfaced in analysis of the documents and policy instruments. The initial external social media policy instrument issued by the Government of Canada in 2011 noted a number of potential challenges that engaging the platform technologies posed, for example, privacy, information management, and risk. However, the policy was predicated on a more static view of information generated online, essentially adapting social media to older technology, regulation, and existing instruments. Social media platforms were still primarily perceived by the Government of Canada as a communication tool, and the policy instruments were yet to consider the regulative powers inscribed in the technology artifact itself. As Klang and Nolan argue, it cannot be viewed separately. Because of the affordances of technologies and the practices developed and developing as a result, as surfaced in the findings, the traditional hierarchies of regulation, as well as rights and obligations, are pitted against each other in various new ways. The research shows that challenges arise when governments fail to recognize the complexity that is particularly visible in attempts to resolve the public and private roles of government employees within the framework of the information and communication technology infrastructures. As Klang and Nolan argue, quote, policy shows an overwhelming desire to simplify reality, unquote, with a view that individuals' public and private personas are static rather than fluid. Some participants reported a perception that policy instruments failed to consider the nature of the practices that social media tools support, and did not allow for a nuanced understanding of the online digital environment and its evolving practices. The do's and don'ts in the policies with regard to identifying oneself as a public servant are prevalent, whereas the spirit of the cultural shift that social media supports is often lost. Findings suggest that emerging social media practices at that time put a strain on existing government frameworks, particularly with regard to retaining, collecting, and preserving its own records and records under its collections mandate. Despite implementing social media, findings also indicate that the Government of Canada's social media adoption and use operated in a bureaucratic environment that struggled to effectively adopt the perceived and promoted ethos of these platforms, for example, horizontal collaborations and ease of information access. The research surfaced constraints in policy development. Policies that were intended to support increased collaboration were held back by a rigid and hierarchical decision-making model. So some frictions in the policy process surfaced in the data as well. Frictions in the policy process manifested in two main ways. First, the findings revealed tensions in the policy development process with regard to the generation of social media policy instruments. Attempted innovation in the policy process was deemed to be hampered by entrenched bureaucratic, policy structures. Second, social media tools were perceived as being co-opted by more formal entities, such as ministerial committees, and this was understood by participants as an attempt by the Government of Canada to be perceived as being innovative. Participants reported skepticism in the policy development process around the Government of Canada's official adoption of emergent information and communication technologies, particularly social media. Participants spoke particularly to the development of the Guideline for External Use of Web 2.0, which was informally initiated in 2008, but was not completed until 4 years later in 2011. A number of participants reported on the slow pace at which policy development occurred in the Government of Canada. Due to the nature of social media platforms and their perceived sociocultural and political status, as well as their associated potential risks, participants suggested that the policy instruments addressing social media use attracted more scrutiny at higher levels within the Government of Canada than similar policy instruments at the same level. As the guideline was the first Treasury Board policy instrument issued on the use of external social media tools, it received additional multi-level attention. While a non-mandatory guideline would not usually require a great degree of consultation, this particular instrument went to deputy ministers for consultation and was announced by a government minister. As such, it briefly put social media in the policy spotlight and created broader awareness at a number of levels. It suggested that the decision to make this inaugural policy instrument a it was suggested in the data that the decision to make this inaugural policy instrument a mandatory guideline was predicated on the idea that a guideline that was solely applied to social media could stand on its own and would aid public servants in understanding how a social media use policy potentially interacted with other legislation and policy instruments, and how to think about their use of social media in their rules and work practices. The data revealed slow progress in getting innovation into the policy development process when it came to the social media policy instruments. The Social Media Policy Development Committee was formed to investigate the potential use of social media technologies in policy development. A number of participants likened the committee's mandate to reinventing the wheel. They were critical of what they viewed as a naive approach to crowdsourcing policy development. Quote, "We're really good at talking about innovation, we're really bad about implementing innovation," unquote. Participants noted that policy development has more complexity than just attempting to design Twitter acceptable use. And further, policy development in the Government of Canada involves a plethora of approaches depending on the department or agency undertaking it. According to the data, the Government of Canada does not have one policy framework. It has as many policy frameworks as there are senior analysts in government. Frictions were surfaced as some perceived the social media policy practices that were being enacted by public servants as being shoehorned into a more bureaucratic process, possibly due to the inaugural nature of the social media policy instruments under discussion. Additionally, the bandwagon approach to onboarding social media tools in the policymaking infrastructure was perceived by some participants as co-opting an ongoing set of developing and interconnected practices in potentially superficial ways. The research engaged in critical analysis of tensions that arose during early stages of social media adoption within the Government of Canada. The project's findings questioned the ability of future generations to hold government accountable, particularly because of the government's use of proprietary platforms and the organizational frictions that potentially develop when technologies marketed as agile are adopted into bureaucratic systems. Social media platforms are not neutral, and therefore the policy instruments that guide their use and content in relation to government use and public information will need to effectively engage with this reality. Operative policy instruments that guide engagement of social media technologies by government agencies and individuals, and the products generated within these platforms require evidence-based policy development. The findings provide evidence for use of external social media platforms by public servants and agencies, and the generation of information and records of potential business and long-term value to government. However, policy instruments, from legislation downward, had yet to catch up to effectively deal with this advancement in government information practices. So, the policy implications. The results of this study contribute to the policy dialogue, particularly with regard to the policy implications of government adoption and use of for-profit online platforms for information generation and sharing. Evidence-based policy making on the part of the government may be difficult when operating in an environment where much of the operations and information, for example, metadata, algorithms, terms of use, etc., are unavailable and/or in continuous and unpredictable flux. As the findings suggest, agile policy development in the Government of Canada had yet to occur, which may pose a challenge to supporting the effective use of these platforms as they evolve and change. Public sector information moving into corporately controlled platforms has implications for the erosion of public protections and access. Citizens increasingly rely on commercial digital media platforms to address a variety of information needs, including engaging with government, which is also encouraged via government department social media accounts. The myth of neutrality and unbiased platforms has been examined by critical information and internet scholars. Yet the majority of users still trust the contents of social media platforms and are unaware of their biases, for example, racial and gender biases, coded in value structures, and mediated content. These must be considered and engaged in developing policy instruments that guide government use of social media platforms. Democratic governments are not-for-profit models and are tasked with the rights and well-being of all citizens. They need to be far warier of abandoning these responsibilities in the haste to use for-profit digital systems. As critical information scholar Safia Noble states, public policy matters. For governments, which are the trusted custodians of much of an individual's most private information, for example, healthcare records, legal and financial records, amongst others, engagement with commercial social media platforms is not without consequence, with potential harms including to an individual's privacy, dignity, and self-identity. Issues of increased surveillance, biased algorithms, privacy challenges, access issues, and lack of transparency are but some of the obstacles these technologies present. These challenges are arguably compounded in the realm of public information, where the agency of individuals regarding what and if they share their personal information is predicated on the legislative requirements of government, for example, the need to share financial information for tax purposes, health information with health records. What is at stake is too important to leave to de facto policies of commercial platforms and their architecture designed to monetize personal data. So, are such platforms ungovernable, or is there a need to explore alternative ways to bring international responsibilities and obligations to bear on these platforms? This brings us to some potential and opportunities for future research. A greater understanding of social media practices in government can assist in advancing evidence-based policymaking and effective policy instruments. I suggest that conceivably, social media pose what we would call a wicked problem in relation to records, archives, and information policy. By positioning this challenge as a wicked problem, the temptation to find fixed solutions may be replaced with imagining ways forward that draw upon ongoing innovation, engagement, and collaboration in service to an evolving suite of elucidating propositions, endeavors, and investigations that call out and problematize key aspects of social media, particularly those considerations that currently make transparent access and preservation only an imagined possibility. These include proprietary, profit-driven platform models, an increasingly monetized internet and data sphere, closed and inaccessible algorithms, and tensions between traditional information paradigms and new models of openness and transparency. Social media platforms and the practices users engage in evolve often more rapidly than legislation can respond to the resulting shifts. The internet and social media platforms are de facto ungoverned spaces that have given rise to previously unforeseen and still little understood uses and affordances, from political disruption, socioeconomic influence, and data privacy and ethics questions. Platforms are often not bounded by national borders, highlighting the global nature of the policy challenges. However, policies that engage with issues such as privacy, data protection, and access are often necessarily national or regional in scope. Agnes Callamard, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions, argues that the technology revolution we are undergoing is creating huge challenges to our democratic societies. She suggests exploring binding treaty and governance models for large global technology companies, similar to those entered into by nation states. Examining frameworks such as UNESCO's Internet Universality indicators that seek to gain better national and global understandings of Internet policies and the digital environment to better understand digital inequalities may surface pathways to ensure ongoing and long-term access to records in support of human rights, exercising of democratic rights, and in aid of long-term remembering. The Rome Principles posit the Internet should be human rights-based, open, accessible to all, and involve multi-stakeholder participation in its governance. As the world's information and records become increasingly digital, online, and interactive in their manifestations, and world events such as the COVID-19 pandemic highlight the importance of the Internet and digital platforms that facilitate connection and access. It is of paramount importance that those agencies tasked with ensuring the long-term preservation and accessibility to the public record are advancing their knowledge and capacity to do so, and that policy instruments exist to ensure this is possible. Thank you very much.